Because within the 12 hours or so, Hegseth had walked that back. Vice President J.D. Vance said that, in fact, everything, including ramping up sanctions and potential American military involvement, was on the table if the Russians didn't play ball. Um, and so they've been on both sides of the NATO issue. They've been on both sides of the U.S. Involvement issue, and they've been on both sides of the sanctions issue. I suppose you could see that as telling the Russians that there is both everything to play for and everything to lose.
Well, on that note, we had some remarkable comments from President Trump last night. I mean, just to read you one quote, he said during a press conference, Ukraine should never have started it, as in the war. They could have traded land. It's been a long time since Kyiv had an election. Zelensky has a 4% approval rating. Now, leaving aside the fact that I mean, there is a lot factually inaccurate in that, not least this idea of having a 4% approval rating and that somehow Ukraine started it. But just the very fact that President Trump is using that kind of language so freely, what are we to read into that?
Well, first of all, I'm really struggling to leave aside all of the factual inaccuracies. In fact, I'm struggling to find a factually accurate aspect of that statement. Zelensky's approval rating is somewhere between 57 and 62%. Trump, I think, is 47 or below. Right? So, we could go on from there. It's revisionist history from start to finish. But I think kind of the most troubling aspect of that statement, the fact, I mean, look, we know that Trump likes to be provocative. We know that he likes, in his view, to shake things up, and he sometimes thinks that means that the chips will land in places that are favorable to him. But the reality was that his Secretary of State, not 48 hours before that statement, had said, of course, Ukraine will have a seat at the table. And this was by way of answering a question from a reporter about when Ukraine would get that seat at the table, and whether, in fact, Ukraine would get that seat at the table. And so, what he's done is he's pulled the rug out from under the man, and in fact, the institution is the Department of State, his entire diplomatic apparatus that is there to represent his interests as president of the United States and the national interests of the United States as such. How that is meant to inspire confidence in anybody, including the Russians, if at the end of the day, what he wants is for the Russians to trust him, is not clear to me.
A lot of people say that Donald Trump likes to see himself as this master negotiator, this brilliant deal maker. And yet it seems to me that Trump's team in the past week or so has essentially offered or certainly mooted giving in to all of Putin's major demands. I mean, saying that Ukrainian territory will not return to pre-2014 and probably neither pre-2022 borders, saying there'll be no NATO membership for Ukraine, no US soldiers in Ukraine, the withdrawal of US soldiers from other European nations, notably the Baltics, and also sanctions relief. I mean, if you're Vladimir Putin, that is pretty much everything you want, is it not?
Well, it's certainly a lot of things off of his wish list. I'm not sure that it's quite everything. What Putin is certainly hoping to do is to use these negotiations to achieve what he could not achieve on the battlefield, and that is a number of those things that he's been unable to achieve. But I think there's a bit more to it than that. I do think, though, it's useful to sort of unpick a little bit of those statements. And again, the context around those statements, right? So Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, ahead of the Munich Security Conference, did say that, as you quoted or as you referenced, that NATO was off the table, the territory was off the table, that in fact, NATO protection for any European troops who the Americans have said would need to go in to enforce the ceasefire would also be most likely off the table. That is not the way you want to go into a negotiation, right? Having already forfeited everything. And I think they recognized that very quickly, because within the 12 hours or so, Hegseth had walked that back. Vice President J.D. Vance said that, in fact, everything, including ramping up sanctions and potential American military involvement, was on the table if the Russians didn't play ball. Um, and so they've been on both sides of the NATO issue. They've been on both sides of the U.S. Involvement issue, and they've been on both sides of the sanctions issue. I suppose you could see that as telling the Russians that there is both everything to play for and everything to lose, and thus keeping them interested in the negotiations. And that would be, in keeping with the way that Trump seems to seek deals across a variety of different domains. But I think what will have the Ukrainians and the Europeans very nervous is that this is all well and good if what you're doing, if what you're looking to do is a short-term transaction. Right, you're looking to walk into a room and walk out of that room with maximum gain in the moment that allows you to then pivot and focus on something else, which clearly I think is what the Americans are trying to achieve. But that's not what the Europeans and the Ukrainians are trying to
Mm.
achieve. This is a war on the European continent, and given Russia's form, right, with the Minsk One and Minsk Two agreements, both of which were violated by the Russians, given Russia's form in violating ceasefires with Georgia and elsewhere. I think the Europeans and the Ukrainians need an agreement that deters Russian aggression in the long run. And that does not seem to be the focus. That is something that requires a very careful, a very thoughtful, and a very coordinated diplomatic approach. And that is exactly what the American administration at the moment seems not to be pursuing.
And is that because the Trump team don't recognize the threat of future Russian expansion in Europe and the threat that Putin will go again in a few years' time for Ukraine or the Baltics or wherever? Or is it that they don't care?
Well, that requires, access to headspaces that I don't have. I suppose were I Trump's psychotherapist, I might be able to give you an answer, but I'm not. I mean, I think there is certainly reason to argue for both sides of that equation. The Republican foreign policy establishment has been itching for a long time to pivot away from Europe and pivot to the Indo-Pacific, to pivot to China in particular, as well as to Iran. So not worrying about Europe and letting Europe worry about itself has been an agenda item for successive Republican presidents. And in fact, for even a lot of people sort of on the center and the center left of American foreign policy. So that is not where the Biden administration was, right? But it's not entirely surprising that, a post-Biden administration would have gone in that direction, perhaps not as hard and as fast. But
Mm.
there's also, as given what you just quoted from Donald Trump, from overnight, there's certainly reason to believe that Trump's view of reality, right, is one that aligns much more closely with the Kremlin's view of reality. We also saw Vice President Vance's really quite extraordinary speech. I call it a campaign speech for AFD and to a certain extent for Reform UK. In Munich, right, which also, despite some references to the U.S. and Europe sharing common values, was really quite vociferous about the degree to which this administration is going to pursue very, very different values than any previous administration, and really than any government is pursuing in Europe at the moment, minus maybe Viktor Orban in Hungary, right? So. Um, I think there is reason to worry, right, that this is an administration that may see more common cause with Russia, and certainly, Russia wants to portray that idea as well. It demobilizes, it discombobulates the Europeans, and makes it much more difficult for them to galvanize around a strategy that would defend simultaneously against Moscow and Washington.
So, what, in your view, Sam, is the minimum level of security guarantee that needs to be offered to Ukraine to make both the Ukrainians and the Europeans more broadly feel secure, feel like Vladimir Putin faces an effective deterrent against future expansion?
Well, I'm afraid that an effective deterrent against, further aggression is not a minimal thing, right? We've been unsuccessful. Europe and NATO and the U.S. have been unsuccessful, or demonstrably unsuccessful at deterring Russia from going into Ukraine in 2014 to begin with, and then from going much harder in 2022, and from continuing to escalate. We have seen, however, that the Russians have been unwilling to countenance a direct escalation that would involve or risk military conflict with Europe and with NATO and with the United States itself. Clearly, direct military confrontation with the United States is not something they feel they need to worry about at the moment, and they're probably right. But I don't think that means that they would like to risk an all-out war with the European allies. And And I think that sort of points in the direction of where things need to go. So Keir Starmer has already talked about putting troops on the ground as part of a peacekeeping deal in Ukraine. The French are talking about something very similar. The Danes are talking in that direction. Clearly, not everybody in Europe is going to go in this direction, but I think that the ethos behind that, the idea behind that, is that you create a situation in which the calculation for Russia of violating whatever ceasefire emerges from these talks is one that inevitably involves the risk of quite significant consequence, including military consequence. Whether that the exact number of troops that requires,
Mm.
exactly where they need to be, the extent to which they need to be immediately in harm's way, I think is something that the military analysts will be able to think about much more clearly than I can as a political analyst. But at the end of the day, it's a political question, right? Putin needs to fear that a renewed war from his side will not just put him back at war with Ukraine, it will put him at war with with Europe. I think that's the kind of deterrence that can be effective. It's the kind of deterrence that Europe can provide if it wants to. But I think that European leaders need to be clear with themselves and with their publics that
Mm.
that's not a minimal thing, right? That is about putting, at the end of the day, European troops and European societies and economies and states on the line in the defense of Ukraine and in the defense of peace and security on the continent.
And in fairness to the Trump administration, are they not right to say that Europe for too long has actually lived off the largesse of American defense spending and probably hasn't woken up to the fact, despite repeated warnings, to the fact that Europe needs to be spending more on its own defense?
It's one thing for Europe to come to terms with the Americans really not being part or critical part of the solution, essential part of the solution to European security. And even that is somewhat problematic because there has historically been a division of labor in NATO, right? So American heavy lift capacity is very important for Europe's ability to defend itself, and that's been something that European governments and the Americans have agreed on for decades. To suddenly say, okay, we're going to take that away, right, does really kneecap the European allies in a very problematic way. But what Europe has been unprepared for is the prospect that the US would not simply be not part of the solution, they could actually be part of the problem. And that's an equation that I think nobody in Europe has countenanced, nobody in Europe has really thought about, and that they're very rapidly having to come to terms with.
Thank you for watching today's episode of Frontline. For early access to our videos, member-only Q&As and live streams, then sign up for a membership via the link in the description. And for the latest news and breaking stories, listen to Times Radio and follow us at thetimes.com.